The Battle of Kapyong, Part 3. Despite their previous failures, the Chinese launched another series of attacks from 11:30, and these attacks continued for the next 2 hours, again targeting 12th Platoon under the command of Lieutenant John Ward. Failing to break through again, the Chinese suffered heavy casualties before the assault ended. From 13:30 there was another lull in the fighting for an hour and a half, although D Company continued to sustain mortar fire and machine gun and rifle fire. Believing that the battle may continue into the night, Grosvenor made the decision to pull 12th Platoon back in order to adopt a tighter company perimeter, lest his forward platoon be overrun and destroyed. The movement was completed without incident, and shortly after the newly vacated position was assaulted by a large Chinese force which had failed to detect the withdrawal. The Chinese moved quickly as they attempted to establish their position on the northern end of the ridge, only to be heavily engaged by Australian machine gun fire and rifle fire and artillery. On the Canadian front, B Company of the 2nd Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry had completed its deployment by 1100 hours. The battalion now occupied a northward-facing arc, curving from the summit of Hill 677 in the west to the high ground closest to the river. D Company held the summit on the battalion's left, C Company the central forward slope, while A and B Company held the right flank. The high grass and severe terrain of Hill 677 limited the ability of each company to provide mutual support, however, while at the same time it afforded any attacking force limited avenues of approach and even less cover or concealment for an assault. 24th of April passed with little activity, with the Chinese continuing to focus on the Australians across the river. Meanwhile, the Canadians continued to strengthen their defences as reports of growing Chinese concentrations came in from forward companies. Each company was allocated a section of Vickers medium machine guns as well as 3 60mm mortars. Defensive fire tasks were registered, while additional ammunition was pushed out to the forward companies in the afternoon. Although originally intending on holding until the Australians could be relieved by the US 5th Cavalry Regiment, Burke had decided during the morning to withdraw the 3rd RAR, and this had prompted the cancellation of B Company's assault. With the Australians facing encirclement, Burke had ordered a fighting withdrawal back to the Middlesex area, to new defensive positions in rear of the brigade. Despite holding Chinese at bay throughout the morning and afternoon, the increasing difficulty of resupply and casualty evacuation made it clear that the Australians would be unable to hold Hill 504 for another night in its exposed and isolated positions. Planning for the withdrawal had begun as the Chinese renewed their assault on D Company around 11:30, while Ferguson and O'Dowd discussed the withdrawal by radio at 12:30. With the Chinese dominating the road south, Ferguson ordered his companies to withdraw along a ridge running 3 kilometres southwest from Hill 504, just east of the Kapyong River. The Middlesex Regiment lay a further 1 kilometre to the southwest of the foot of the ridge and could be reached by the ford previously secured by Gerke, which would act as the battalion checkpoint for the withdrawal. US Marine Corps Corsairs in Korea. After 1500 hours, an airstrike was called in to dislodge the surviving Chinese in front of D Company. However, the attack by 2 US Marine Corps F-4U Corsairs was mistakenly directed at the Australians themselves after their positions were wrongly marked by the spotter plane. 2 men were killed and several badly burnt by napalm before the attack was broken off after the company's second in command, Captain Michael Ryan, ran out under Chinese fire waving a marker panel. The company medical orderly, Private Ronald Dunk, was subsequently awarded the military medal for his efforts assisting the wounded despite his own injuries. The Chinese quickly attempted to exploit the chaos, moving against D Company's long exposed eastern flank. 11 Platoon on the main ridge forward of the summit was subjected to a frontal assault. However, unaffected by the napalm, they broke up the Chinese attack and inflicted heavy casualties on them. Regardless, further Chinese attempts to infiltrate the Australian positions continued into the afternoon. The withdrawal was scheduled to begin shortly following the misdirected airstrike and was to be preceded by an artillery bombardment with high explosive and smoke at 1600 hours. The American tanks were subsequently moved forward to provide cover, and when the New Zealand artillery failed to fire at the appointed hour, they provided direct fire support. Still in contact, the Australians began to pull back, fighting a number of well-disciplined rearguard actions as the companies leapfrogged each other. Meanwhile, the New Zealand artillery kept the Chinese at bay after it finally commenced firing. B Company had taken 39 Chinese prisoners during the earlier fighting, and unable to leave these behind, they were used to carry many of the Australian wounded and much of their equipment as well. O'Dowd's fear that the Chinese might have blocked the withdrawal route was not realised, and B Company moved back along the ridge and down to the ford without incident, eventually reaching the Middlesex area after dark. C Company was the next to withdraw, departing at 16:30, just after suffering another casualty from sniper fire. Saunders led his company up the spur and then south down the main ridge without incident. With B Company and C Company successfully withdrawing down the ridge line, the next to withdraw was A Company. They were not so successful and were followed by the Chinese during their retreat. Murdoch had been concerned lest he and his men should be engaged when they reached the Kapyong River in an exhausted condition and with little ammunition. Luck was with the Australians, however, and due to difficulties of communication and navigation along the ridge line in the dark, unfortunately elements of A Company had become separated, and the last two platoons descended to the river too early to strike the ford. However, reaching a deserted part of the bank, they realised their mistake and immediately turned west again, following the riverbank to the ford. The Chinese did not follow this sudden final turn and plunged on into the river, giving A Company an unexpected opportunity to break free. The Chinese were subsequently detected by the Canadians on Hill 677 and were fired upon, although fortunately for them the Canadian fire did not hit the Australians. The possibility that the Canadians could end up firing on the Australians had been foreseen earlier. However, problems with the radio relay between the Canadians and the Australians meant there would be no guarantee that the withdrawing force would not be mistaken for Chinese as they crossed the river. As it turned out, the last elements of A Company who went astray were not fired upon by the Canadians, and they all made it back to the Middlesex region successfully. Only D Company, which had been holding the summit and had withdrawn last, was heavily engaged and was unable to move at the scheduled time. The Chinese launched a determined assault, preceding it with heavy machine gun and mortar fire before attempting to overrun the forward pits. Once again the Australians repelled the Chinese assault, and Grosvenor decided to thin out his position before the situation deteriorated further. With one platoon covering their movement, D Company subsequently withdrew, closely pursued by the Chinese. During the rapid withdrawal after the first Chinese attack, Private Keith Gwither was accidentally left behind after being knocked unconscious and buried in a forward pit by a mortar round. He regained consciousness some hours later and was subsequently captured by the Chinese, who had by then captured Hill 504 and were digging in. Finally, after dark, the Australians succeeded in achieving a clean breakaway, a clean withdrawal. And D Company was able to safely withdraw. By 23:30 the battalion was clear, completing its withdrawal in good order and intact and suffering only minimal casualties. Regardless, the previous 24 hours of fighting had been costly for the Australians, resulting in 32 killed, 59 wounded and 3 captured, the bulk of them in A Company and battalion headquarters. Yet their stout defence had halted the assault on the brigade's right flank and had inflicted far heavier casualties on the Chinese before being withdrawn. Significantly for the Australians, 25th of April was Anzac Day. However, following their successful withdrawal, the Chinese turned their attention to the Canadians on the left flank.